You're listening to The Conversation. Every decade or so, the American Psychiatric Association publishes a new version of a thick, chunky book used by psychiatrists and psychologists around the world. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM for short, is like a dictionary of all psychiatric conditions and how to diagnose them. And each new version is hotly debated. In the mid-1990s, an update to the DSM changed the diagnosis of autism from something quite narrow to something much broader. People who might have been previously overlooked now had a name for their experience. And soon, thousands more people began to be diagnosed with autism. Now, this rise in cases has been labelled an epidemic by Donald Trump and his health secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We don't have an answer to this critical question, despite the cataclysmic impact of the epidemic on our nation's children.
In a rambling statement long on opinion, but with little new science, President Donald Trump said the FDA would tell doctors that the use of acetaminophen or Tylenol in pregnancy can increase the risk of autism.
As American politicians give oxygen to unproven theories about what has caused the rise in autism cases, we track the central role that diagnosis has played in that change.
All of a sudden, there was a diagnostic category that represented this very large number of individuals who didn't meet criteria for that more significant disability, but still met criteria because they required help.
In this episode, autism expert Andrew Whitehouse explains why this shift in diagnosis happened and what it's meant for autistic people and the support they get. I'm Gemma Ware from The Conversation, an independent news and analysis platform partnering journalists with academics to help bring research knowledge to as many people as possible. Welcome to The Conversation Weekly, where experts explain how we ended up here. Andrew Whitehouse, you're the Deputy Director of the Kids Research Institute Australia in Perth and Professor of Autism Research at the University of Western Australia. You've published hundreds of papers about autism research and you chaired the committee that generated Australia's first national guideline for autism diagnosis. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Gemma.
Let's start in the early 1990s. If somebody was diagnosed back then as autistic, what would that have meant?
The early 1990s is actually quite early in terms of the modern history of autism. So autism was first introduced into the Diagnostic manual in 1980. So really quite recent in the sort of history of medicine and psychiatry and paediatrics. Back then, children, and it really was only children were diagnosed when they had presence of restricted and repetitive behaviours, as well as the presence of social and communication and interaction difficulties. So that meant we didn't diagnose a huge number of children, and the children that we did diagnose were those children who were often not talking and often had quite significant intellectual disabilities, profound difficulties in interacting in everyday life. The general support programs were quite limited, and that often subjected children to quite intensive therapies, so your speech therapies and occupational therapies, upwards of 40 hours per week. And that was the recommendation for many years, 40 plus hours a week. And think about that, that's 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. It's a little mini job for a 3 or 4 year olds. So it was really intensive interactions and there wasn't much choice above and beyond that. And so autism had this really narrow definition. It really said to us, well, actually, this is a very clearly defined neurodevelopmental condition within these small boundaries. But of course, what's happened over time is there has been a gradual expansion of those boundaries.
So it was really a small number of people and mainly children who were being diagnosed.
Very much so. When I started in the field in 98, 99, we diagnosed in about 1 in every 2,000 children. That was pretty much the same in every Anglo-Western country. Nowadays, certainly in Australia, what we're seeing is a diagnosis in every 1 in every 40 or 1 in every 50 children. So that's an extraordinary increase over the past 25 years.
So in 1994, a new version of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, was published, the DSM-4, and that included an expanded definition of autism. What were the debates leading up to that moment when the definition changed?
The debates were stimulated by research. Once you put a condition within the diagnostic manual, research flows. And what the research showed after the introduction in 1980 was that actually children, and in fact adults, can have a diagnosis or show those core behaviours that we use to diagnose autism, social communication differences, restricted and repetitive behaviours, but actually have intellectual abilities within and even above typical limits and can be highly verbal. And so there were lots of debates around that actually this kind of narrow diagnosis of autism for children and children only with significant disability. Actually, if we're going to look at those core behaviours of autism, these are present in a vast range of people who may have milder levels of difficulty. And that's what led up to the 1994 Diagnostic Manual, which eventually did expand those diagnostic boundaries.
Were there people lobbying for change from within kind of the treatment community, people who were working with autistic children?
Very much there were people lobbying, and this is one of the very interesting histories of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, is that they are not just medical documents, they're sociological documents as well. There were lobbying groups to say that actually, I'm showing those core behaviours of autism and I'm able to communicate, I'm able to hold down a job. And that all feeds in, along with the empirical evidence, to those discussions about what a next edition of the manual might look like.
So what was the language that was eventually decided on, that it eventually ended up in the DSM-4?
Actually, the DSM-3 diagnosis of childhood autism was actually split into 3 different diagnoses, and that's where autistic disorder, that was that sort of core, more classic autism where children are quite significantly disabled. But there were 2 categories that sought to describe individuals with milder levels of disability. One being one you'll know of, which is Asperger's disorder, as it was in the manual, which was for individuals with less significant disability but were quite odd in their social mannerisms. And then there was one that was used quite a lot but really never captured the public consciousness because it was not a very catchy title. It was called PDD-NOS, Pervasive Developmental Disorder Not Otherwise Specified, which was really...
Oh, it's a mouthful.
Yes, it is. A diagnosis that was for children who are not showing those core behaviours of autism but have significant need. And that really produced enormous complexity to the diagnosis process. But certainly what we saw then is a swelling of the numbers of children and adults receiving a diagnosis of one of these 3 conditions. And that really was the birth in the imagination and then in the research around the idea of a spectrum of disability, a spectrum of autism, from the more significant disability and autistic disorder through to your milder end of Asperger's syndrome.
Were there other things that were happening around this time which also fed into rates of diagnosis?
We were starting to recognise people with disability and their tireless advocacy efforts to see a discussion of disability in the world. Previously, institutionalisation was still a thing and still a very much a mainstream thing. In the 90s and 2000, that was all changing with disability advocacy. And so the idea of coming forward with disability and not being ashamed and even indeed being proud became more of a pervasive thought pattern. What also happened is then it caught the public consciousness. When I started in 98, 99, Rain Man was the only thing that people knew about autism.
Raymond?
Yeah?
Are you good with numbers?
Yeah.
Do you know how much 312 times 123 is?
38376.
He's right. What? He's right.
He's right?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden we had autism was being talked about more and more, often through the sort of lens of Asperger's syndrome, which we would see on TV programs, celebrities having children diagnosed. So it became much more of a common discussion topic as well. And that not only led to families talking about it, families of children being aware, but also clinicians. We can't underestimate how important it is for clinicians to be aware of this, to even have this in their mind that this might be a diagnosis. But that awareness from disability advocates, from social and pop culture, really brought that to the fore as well.
So you had this growing awareness in public consciousness, but you also had this clinical definition that was there in the manuals that clinicians could go to. And what did that do in terms of numbers?
What you tend to see is that diagnostics take about 5 or 6 years to catch up. So we were seeing, in the start of my professional life in 1998 and 1999, just those children who were receiving a diagnosis of childhood autism. But then in the early 2000s, that's when we saw the really big first wave of the big boom of diagnoses that we saw in the context of autism. And it was a really interesting time, and I mean that genuinely from an intellectual point of view. It was also a really worrying time in terms of our clinical systems that were geared to develop and support and manage clinically children, and a relatively small number of children through the 80s and 90s, all of a sudden were being overwhelmed by the numbers of children receiving diagnoses and then quite appropriately, requiring support and management. So it was both sort of amazing, but also quite overwhelming in terms of how we were going to manage these children going forward.
Was there a corresponding increase in all three categories of autism that were set out in the DSM, from the most severe cases to the milder cases of autism?
Yeah. What we tended to see is that actually that autistic disorder, your more classic autism that was relating to the DSM-3 version of sort of description of autism, there was a small increase, but really the bulk of the increase came from your Asperger's syndrome and diagnoses and your PDD-NOS diagnoses, because all of a sudden there was a diagnostic category that represented this very large number of individuals who didn't meet criteria for that sort of more significant disability, but still met criteria because they required help. And so that was really where the bulk of the increase was found.
So at the same time as this definition was shifting in the 90s and clinicians were dealing with it and seeing more diagnoses happening, human genome mapping began and more research into the genetic causes of autism was going on. Can you talk us through what was happening in that part of the science and what scientists were looking for?
Up until the 1970s and even the 1980s, there was a strong strain of thought that actually autism was very much caused by parenting techniques. And as is usually the case, mums were unfairly blamed. And then along in the late 1970s came along the first twin study, which helped us to actually say that, hang on, that is total nonsense and offensive. Autism is very clearly a genetic-based condition. And then, of course, fast forward all the way to the sort of the turn of the 21st century, there was the Human Genome Project, which was this big race to sequence all of those 3 billion DNA base pairs that we all have within our DNA. And the thought there was that by doing this, we were going to identify the gene that was going to cause all sorts of these range of conditions. And autism was absolutely front and centre because we were seeing this big rise in the numbers of children being diagnosed. We soon found out it was far more complex than that.
What were the researchers finding then? What has emerged from that field of research?
Well, we understood that actually autism at the biological level is certainly not one condition. There is not one gene or one gene set that leads to a similar pattern of brain differences, which then leads to those core behaviours that we use to diagnose autism. In fact, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of different biological pathways that lead children to ultimately end up to that point. And so if I see, half a dozen kids in the clinic in a morning, it's likely, if not certain, that the autism that is expressing in themselves is actually caused by different biological pathways. And so to that extent, for me, that was a really liberating moment that actually we can, sort of take our head back out from the genes and the neuroscience and actually focus on people and how we can best support those people to be who they want to be.
Why liberating? And how did it feed into this kind of growing diagnoses?
People were worried at the time, and there were certain scares that have been found to be fraudulent scares around vaccines, around all sorts of other things that was really part of people's day-to-day experiences in the turn of the 21st century, in the same conversation with a very large rise in the numbers of kids, along with the Human Genome Project. And so the research field, I wouldn't say got entirely blinkered, but we were very focused on identifying genes and brain differences, which led us for many, many years to ignore the realities that kids and families were experiencing. Those kids and families wanted support here and now, and we, through the excitement of the science, the sort of very fast pace that we were seeking to find answers, somehow didn't cotton on to that, and the complexity in the genetics was very, very clear in helping me raise my eyes back out and let's actually think about people here rather than genes and brains.
So jump forward about a decade to 2013, and then a new DSM, a new diagnostic manual, DSM-5, is published, and that's the one we have today. And this introduces the term autism spectrum disorder. What led to that change, and what did it actually say?
Well, it was the Human Genome Project. What we found is that once we could start looking at molecular genetics, so those sort of DNA base pairs, we started to find that actually there was no clear genetic differences, clear brain differences, clear biological difference in all between Asperger's syndrome, PDD-NOS, and autistic disorder. And that actually these were artificial categories that we had created that perhaps were not actually a helpful reflection of the complexity of humanity on the spectrum. And so DSM-5 came around, and the thought was, let's actually embrace that complexity and instead put these three conditions into this omnibus category of autism spectrum disorder. And the diagnostic definition enabled children or people to be diagnosed with quite significant disability, as well as people with milder levels of disability in between as well. And that's what we have today. It probably has in some ways increased the numbers of children receiving a diagnosis under the category of an autism spectrum disorder. And part of that, of course, is that simply autism is now really a household name. So it's really tough to disentangle the differences between the clinical realities, that's the diagnostic manuals, the sociological realities, how much things really sort of become part of our human culture, and that feeds into diagnostic manual, and then of course the scientific realities that are meant to underpin it all.
Every week, Michelle Grattan offers you a ringside seat to the latest in Australian politics with interviews and insights from political insiders. On the Conversations Politics with Michelle Grattan podcast, we cut through the spin and get to the substance with independent analysis of the issues that really matter. Stay informed, search and follow Politics with Michelle Grattan wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. Andrew, you've told us about all this research into autism over many decades, and yet to hear the current US Health Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., talk about it, it's as if doctors and researchers have ignored this rising number of cases of autism until just this year, and the word epidemic has been used. And now the language is really trying to find a culprit in environmental factors, and there's been this controversial mention of paracetamol, Tylenol being seen as a cause, although that's been widely debunked by scientific research. You've been researching autism and working with autistic people for a long time. How do you deal with that narrative?
Well, it's one I'm very practiced at, I should say that, because autism is something that attracts a huge amount of attention from people with theories, and often these are really well-intentioned theories. Sometimes there is a sinister element behind it. And so you do get really practiced in understanding it. There is no secret or no surprise that there has been a large increase in terms of the numbers of children and adults being diagnosed with autism. That's been known for many years. In fact, it's been talked about really publicly for many years. The greatest effect of that has been on increasing awareness, as well as the expansion of the diagnostic category boundaries, which we've talked about before. That's really been the main contributors to it. However, you know, I'm a scientist, I'm in the business of evidence, and so one must take the evidence wherever it goes. And so if there are environmental differences that have led to a high likelihood that children go on to receive a diagnosis of autism, that's exactly something that we should be following, which means that I feel like I can sort of intellectually be very intellectually honest and standing here and saying that actually we don't have any culprits in any way in terms of a simple environmental difference that is likely leading children to develop differently. That simply doesn't exist. Are there likely to be some in the future? Maybe. And it's most likely to be interacting with genetic factors. How does those environmental factors interact with genetic factors? But again, if that is ever identified, that is likely to be for a small number of cases in certain circumstances. So the idea that there is one smoking gun out there, one simple cause to describe this unbelievable complexity that sits behind humans, It's a misreading of science at best and an utter misuse of science at worst.
And you've described how in the 90s, autism became this sort of umbrella diagnoses from those with severe disabilities who need a lot of support to those who need less support, but still have these social communication issues or repetitive, restrictive behaviours. Where we are now, is there any talk of creating a separate diagnoses, again, for different ends of the spectrum?
Yeah, there is. There's a lot of talk about it. A couple of years ago, The Lancet published a sort of a State of the Union paper on the area of autism. It's called a Lancet Commission. And actually that Lancet Commission recommended the development and adoption of a category called profound autism. And that profound autism category would be a diagnosis that is used for those individuals with very significant disability, almost going back to that 1980 diagnosis around children with quite significant language difficulties, often not speaking, as well as individuals with intellectual disability who have those core autistic features. That raised enormous controversy in the field, or at least a lot of discussion. The authors of the Lancet Commission said that this is really needed because this broad category of autism is very much meaning that those with the most significant needs are not seen. Their needs are not seen as much as they would like, both at the clinical level but also at that human level. And so it's really important that they perhaps have their own category so that they are seen and receive that kind of attention. On the other side, there's been a lot of discussion, particularly amongst the autistic community, that's the individuals diagnosed with autism, that please don't separate us, don't try and divide us, don't divide our category. And so that's a debate that remains to this very day. And we don't know how that one's going to be resolved. But what we do know is that there is a group of people out there, particularly those with significant support needs, who do feel undervalued, they do feel hidden. And that is something that needs to be understood. And in many ways, we need to find a solution for that.
What's driving that from the families of people with more severe disabilities?
Look, I would sit with one or two families a week who would say something along the lines of, my child with very significant needs doesn't have a superpower. My child is beautiful and wonderful and I love him or her so much. I also want to do everything I can to ensure that the disability they have is reduced over time so they can go on and live a long, happy and fulfilling life. And so that's driving that. I'm not saying that I'm here advocating for that. This is just something that I and many others would hear on a weekly basis.
And would that come in the next diagnostic manual, the DSM-6 perhaps? That's going to feed into debates around that, do you think?
What I would always advocate is that decisions around diagnosis are really, in terms of what's in the diagnostic manual, are heavily informed, if not entirely formed, by science and empirical evidence rather than sociological movements. And so actually, ultimately, the fundamental question boils down to, is there empirical evidence around the category of, for example, profound autism as a distinct clinical benefit as a category? And I think that remains to be seen, but that will be the work of those folk who are putting together the DSM-6.
If we think about this conversation we've had, we've gone from no diagnosis to narrow to it widening, and then maybe some people arguing for the case for narrowing it again. If we do that, could that actually cause a drop in the number of cases, kind of make that curve go down?
Well, if there is a narrowing of all categories of autism in terms of, going back to diagnosis of only children with quite significant disability, there would certainly be a drop in the numbers. But I don't think that is a reality, and that's certainly not something that I would be advocating for. I think that if another category is introduced that does narrow, for example, the profound autism category, and as I said, must be based on empirical evidence, then I think we would start to actually be able to understand more about the phenomenon of autism diagnosis, because we'd start to understand what are the diagnoses looking like for those children or individuals with quite significant disability, and we'd start to actually disentangle what might be behind, or at least can we start to parse out what are the differences underpinning the broader increase in autism diagnosis over time.
This moment is pretty fraught, especially in the US, for people who are autistic or caring for autistic children. Is there anything you'd say to them now? Every
moment that we spend talking about nonsense theories around what environmental cause might be causing autism is time, attention, effort, energy that we are not spending on those things that genuinely affect kids and families on a day-to-day basis. Number one, access to early intervention, education, employment, housing, aged care. These are the things that keep families up every night. And every time that we're not speaking about this, we're not actually speaking about the things that matter. So for families, we need to follow the evidence wherever that evidence chases us, and that gives me, I hope that gives extra weight to what I'm about to say, and that's that actually there is no evidence in relation to paracetamol or vaccines in terms of causal relationships with autism, and we need to get better in talking more about those things that matter to families.
Great. Well, thank you, Andrew, for speaking with us today. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Gemma.
You can go to The Conversation to read more about the Trump administration's announcements on autism, including an article by the author of a study of 2.5 million children in Sweden that showed no link between paracetamol use in pregnancy and autism. We'll put some links for further reading in our show notes. This episode was produced by Katie Flood, Mend Marawani and me, Gemma Ware, with sound design by Michelle Macklem. Our theme music is by Nita Saul. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can also sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience. If you like what we do, please support us at donate.theconversation.com, and please do also rate and review the podcast wherever you follow us. Thank you for listening.
Do whales sneeze?
I'm not sure, but luckily I've got an amazing whale expert I can call on.
We essentially go out onto a boat, we go out to the sea, we look for whales, we see a whale breathing.
Who will take us through her experiments.
And then as the whale takes a breath, the drone is flown through the snot and will deliberately collect as much snot as possible.
And let us know the answer. How does that sound, Guy?
That would be fun.
Join us on The Conversation's Curious Kids, wherever you get your podcasts.